Welcome back, fellow traveller. If you were with us last time, you'll remember where we left things. A small stadium in Montevideo, July 1930, 93,000 people, a World Cup final that most of the world did not yet know was happening. The game had been born. It had crossed oceans and found communities, and become something no one in that London pub in 1863 could have imagined. And then the world interrupted it. This episode moves through the middle of the 20th century, through war and recovery and the slow, extraordinary flowering of the game into something genuinely transcendent. It is the story of the players who made people believe that football was not just a sport, but a form of human expression as significant as music or painting or poetry. Not everyone will agree with that, but after tonight, you may find it a little harder to disagree. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath be slow. This time, we go to the golden age. Football interrupted, the war years, and what survived. The story of football between 1930 and 1950 is inevitably the story of the world between 1930 and 1950. And the world between 1930 and 1950 was not a good place. The 1938 World Cup in France was held in the shadow of a continent already sliding toward catastrophe. Germany had annexed Austria the previous year. Czechoslovakia was under pressure. The Spanish Civil War had just ended. Several nations withdrew from the tournament for political reasons. The final, Italy beating Hungary 4-2, was played in Paris, while the newspapers carried stories that everyone knew were pointing toward something terrible. The 1942 and 1946 World Cups were cancelled. The Second World War consumed the world, and football, like everything else, was swallowed by it. And yet football did not disappear entirely. In England, a wartime league was organised, with players appearing for clubs wherever they happened to be stationed. In Germany, football continued through most of the war years, providing a semblance of normalcy to populations living through anything but. In the prisoner of war camps, in the bombed-out fields, in the brief quiet moments between deployments, men played football because it was something human to do in inhuman circumstances. Let's step back for a moment, more than 2 decades before these events. In December 1914, during the famous Christmas truce on the Western Front of the First World War, German and British soldiers climbed out of their trenches and met in no man's land to exchange gifts and, in several documented instances, to play football in the frozen mud between the lines. The exact details vary. Some accounts describe a formal match, others a loose kickabout. But the essential fact is verified by multiple eyewitness accounts in letters and diaries. Men who had been trying to kill each other the day before and would be trying to kill each other again the next day stood in a field on Christmas morning and played football. It tells you something about what the game was, and perhaps something about what peace is, that this is the thing they chose to do with their extraordinary, temporary, heartbreaking freedom. Back to 1945. The war, that later war, the one that had interrupted 2 World Cups, ended that year. The world began, slowly and painfully, to rebuild. And football, which had been kept alive in fragments, in wartime leagues and garrison matches and prison camp kickabouts, reassembled itself with surprising speed. The 1950 World Cup was held in Brazil. England, who had refused to join FIFA in 1928 and had only rejoined in 1946, entered a World Cup for the first time. They were considered strong favourites. In the first round, they lost to the United States of America, 1-0. The result was so shocking that many newspapers in England assumed it was a misprint when they first received the telegram from Brazil. It was not a misprint. Football had moved on without England. The world was playing. The Maracanazo and the afternoon Brazil wept. The 1950 World Cup final was not called a final. Due to the tournament format, it was the last game of a final round robin. But in practice, it was a final. Brazil versus Uruguay played at the Maracanã Stadium in Rio de Janeiro before a crowd of approximately 200,000 people, the largest attendance at a football match in history. A number that has never been surpassed and never will be, because stadiums are no longer built to hold 200,000 people. Brazil needed only a draw to win the World Cup. Uruguay needed to win. Brazil had beaten Sweden 7-1 and Spain 6-1 in the previous games. The morning newspapers had already printed congratulations to the new world champions. A samba had been composed in honor of the victory. The trophy was engraved in advance. Brazil were leading 1-0 at half-time. With 11 minutes remaining, Uruguay equalized. With minutes remaining, they scored again. Uruguay 2, Brazil 1. The final whistle blew. The 200,000 people in the Maracanã went silent. The silence in that enormous stadium is one of the most described moments in football history. People who were there, and there were 200,000 of them, wrote about it for the rest of their lives. The silence of 200,000 people who had been absolutely certain of something, and then had it taken away in 20 minutes. The event became known simply as the Maracanazo, the Maracanã blow. The Uruguayan goalkeeper, Roque Maspoli, who kept a clean sheet in the second half as Uruguay defended their lead, was asked 60 years later what he remembered most about those final minutes. He said, "The silence, not the roar when they scored, not the whistle, the silence afterwards." He said he had never heard anything like it in his life. 200,000 people absolutely quiet. He said it was the most frightening sound he had ever heard. A silence that size, he said, has a weight to it. You can feel it pressing on you. He kept that silence with him for the rest of his life. Brazil would wait 8 years to win a World Cup. When they finally did, in 1958, it would be with a team so gifted, so joyful, so completely unlike anything the world had seen before, that the Maracanazo would finally, at last, be answered. And the answer would come in the form of a 17-year-old boy from a small town in São Paulo state, whose name the world did not yet know. Brazil, 1958, a 17-year-old named Pele. His full name was Edson Arantes do Nascimento. His father, a professional footballer of modest achievement, called him Pele, a nickname whose origin Pele himself always claimed not to understand, saying it was simply a sound that other children at his school used to tease him with, which stuck. He was born in 1940 in the town of Três Corações, 3 Hearts, in the state of Minas Gerais. His family was poor. He shined shoes as a child to help his mother. He practiced football with a grapefruit when he could not afford a ball, with a sock stuffed with newspaper when he could not find a grapefruit. He joined Santos FC at the age of 15. He was called up to the Brazilian national squad at 16. And in 1958, Brazil travelled to Sweden for the World Cup, with a 17-year-old in their squad who had never played a full international match. He played his first World Cup game in the quarter-finals against Wales. He scored the only goal of the game, becoming, at 17 years and 249 days, the youngest player ever to score in a World Cup. A record that stands to this day and will almost certainly never be broken. In the semi-final against France, he scored a hat-trick. In the final against Sweden, in Stockholm, in front of 50,000 Swedes who had come to watch their own team win, he scored twice. His second goal, scored with 7 minutes remaining to make it 5-2, is one of the most replayed moments in football history. He received the ball with his back to goal, flicked it over the head of a defender with his chest, turned and volleyed it into the net before it touched the ground. When the final whistle blew, Pele collapsed on the pitch and wept. His teammates carried him on their shoulders. In the stands, Swedish supporters applauded a Brazilian victory because they had just watched something they understood to be exceptional, and decency required acknowledgement. Pele scored 1,281 goals in 1,363 official matches over a career that lasted from 1956 to 1977. The number is so large that it is difficult to contextualize. It means that in an average game, across his entire career, Pele scored approximately 0.94 goals. For 21 years, in almost every game he played, he scored almost exactly 1 goal. He won 3 World Cups with Brazil in 1958, 1962, and 1970. He is the only player in history to have done so. Multiple foreign governments at war attempted to negotiate ceasefires specifically to watch him play. Nigeria and Biafra, engaged in a brutal civil war in 1967, agreed to a 48-hour ceasefire so that both sides could watch a Santos exhibition match in Lagos. A ceasefire for a football match for one man. Pele played his last World Cup in Mexico in 1970 at the age of 29 with what many consider the greatest team in the history of the tournament. Brazil 1970, with Pelé, Rivellino, Jairzinho, Tostão, Gerson, Carlos Alberto, played football of such exhilarating, flowing, joyful quality that the final, a 4-1 demolition of Italy, is still used as a reference point for what football can be at its absolute best. Carlos Alberto's 4th goal, a sweeping, perfectly timed, full-pace shot from the right following a move that involved almost every player on the pitch, is regularly voted the greatest goal in World Cup history. It was not a goal that came from nowhere. It was the logical conclusion of an entire tournament's worth of possession and movement and joy. It was football saying, "This is what we are. This is what we can do. Watch." Total football, Cruyff, Ajax, and the Dutch Revolution. While Brazil were redefining what football could look like at its most joyful, a very different kind of revolution was taking place in the unlikely setting of Amsterdam. Ajax, a club from a city better known for its canals and its painters than its football, had been quietly building something extraordinary through the late 1960s under a coach named Rinus Michels. What Michels was building was a system, a way of playing that did not depend on fixed positions, that required every player to be comfortable anywhere on the pitch, that used space and movement and intelligent pressing to create and destroy in equal measure. The Dutch called it total voetbal, total football. The idea sounds simple. Every player attacks, Every player defends, and when the ball is lost, the entire team presses immediately to win it back. In practice, it required a level of technical ability, tactical understanding, and physical fitness that had never previously been demanded of an entire team simultaneously. Ajax won the European Cup, the forerunner of the Champions League, the competition between the champions of each European nation, 3 times in a row, in 1971, 1972, and 1973. In those 3 years, they did not just win the competition. They changed the way European football understood itself, and at the center of all of it was Johan Cruyff. Cruyff was not the biggest player on the pitch. He was not the fastest or the strongest. What he was simply the most intelligent footballer who had ever played the game. A player who understood space and time on a football pitch in a way that seemed almost theoretical, who moved not to where the ball was but to where it was going to be, who could slow a game down or accelerate it with a single touch, and who could, when the moment demanded it, do things with a football that made the people watching them gasp and then immediately want to see them again. The Cruyff turn is one of the most imitated moves in football history. In the 1974 World Cup, playing for the Netherlands against Sweden, Cruyff received the ball near the touchline with a Swedish defender closing him down fast from behind. Every expectation, every physical logic, every footballing convention said he would cross the ball or play it back. Instead, he dragged it behind his standing leg with the inside of his right foot, pivoted 180 degrees, and was gone, leaving the defender facing the wrong direction, grasping at empty air. The whole movement took perhaps half a second. The defender, Jan Olsson, a perfectly competent Swedish international, later said it was the most humiliating moment of his career. He said that for half a second, Cruyff had made him believe that up was down. The Cruyff turn has been taught in football academies on every continent ever since. It bears his name because no one before him had thought to do it. The Netherlands reached the 1974 World Cup final, playing what many considered the most beautiful football ever seen at a World Cup. They lost to West Germany 2-1 in one of the most debated results in the history of the tournament. A result that is still argued about in Dutch cafes today, 50 years later. The Netherlands were brilliant. They were better. They lost anyway. Football is not always just. This is part of what makes it real. Cruyff retired from playing in 1984. He returned to Ajax as manager and then moved to Barcelona, where he built the foundations of a footballing philosophy: possession, pressing, positional play, the development of young players through a coherent system that would produce, over the following 3 decades, the most successful club team in the history of the sport. He died in 2016. His influence on the game is so pervasive, so thoroughly absorbed into how modern football thinks about itself, that it is almost impossible now to see where it begins and ends. The great club sides: Real Madrid, Liverpool, AC Milan. While the World Cup provided football with its grandest stage, it was the clubs that provided its continuity. The teams that played not once every 4 years but 40 times a season, year after year, decade after decade, accumulating histories and rivalries and traditions that became woven into the fabric of their cities. Let us spend a moment with 3 of the greatest. Real Madrid in the 1950s was simply the most dominant club team the world had ever seen. Under their president, Santiago Bernabeu, a man who had fought in the Spanish Civil War and emerged from it determined to build something that would make the whole world look at Madrid, Real assembled a team of breathtaking quality. Their centerpiece was Alfredo Di Stefano, an Argentine who had somehow ended up in Spain and who was, in the mid-1950s, the best footballer on earth. Around him were Ferenc Puskás, the Hungarian genius who had defected after the Soviet crushing of the 1956 uprising, and Francisco Gento, the Spanish winger who could run faster with the ball than most people could without it. Real Madrid won the European Cup 5 consecutive times between 1956 and 1960, 5 times in a row. No team has matched that record. Their 1960 European Cup final, a 7-3 victory over Eintracht Frankfurt, played at Hampden Park in Glasgow, watched by 127,000 people, is still considered by many who were there to be the finest club performance in the history of the sport. Alfredo Di Stefano is perhaps the most remarkable figure in the history of Real Madrid, which is saying something given what Real Madrid has been. He was born in Argentina, played for Argentina, Colombia, and then Spain at international level, and his career at Real Madrid lasted 11 years, during which he won 5 European Cups and 8 Spanish league titles. He was so committed to winning that his teammates described him as the most demanding presence they had ever encountered. A player who expected everything from everyone, including himself, at all times. He scored in each of Real Madrid's 5 consecutive European Cup finals. When he finally retired in 1966, his manager said, "We will not see his like again." They have not quite. Liverpool Football Club, under Bill Shankly and then Bob Paisley, dominated English and European football in the 1970s and 1980s with a consistency that has never been replicated in the English game. Shankly, a Scottish miner's son, a former player, a man of such passionate intensity that his pre-match team talks were reportedly delivered at a volume that made the walls vibrate, transformed Liverpool from a mediocre second division club into the dominant force in England. But it was what happened after he retired that is perhaps most remarkable. Paisley, his assistant, took over in 1974 and won 6 league titles, 3 European Cups, and 3 League Cups in 9 seasons, the most decorated managerial reign in British football history, achieved by a man who had never intended to be a manager at all. Under Shankly and Paisley, Anfield became something more than a football ground. It became a place with a sound produced by the Kop, the steep standing terrace behind one goal, 40,000 people singing in the Scouse accent of the city, a sound so distinctive and so powerful that visiting teams described it as a physical thing, something that pressed against you as you walked out of the tunnel. You can close your eyes and almost hear it. Football and Politics, Argentina, 1978. Football and politics have always been intertwined. Mussolini used the 1934 World Cup in Italy as a showcase for fascism. The Soviet Union and the United States Cold War was fought in part on football pitches. The 1969 war between Honduras and El Salvador, a brief, brutal conflict, was sparked in part by a World Cup qualifying match and has become known, incorrectly but revealingly, as the Football War. But perhaps no World Cup sits more uncomfortably in the history of the sport than the 1978 tournament in Argentina. The Argentine military junta which had seized power in a coup in 1976 and was engaged in the systematic murder and disappearance of political opponents. An estimated 30,000 people killed or disappeared in what became known as the Dirty War, hosted the 1978 World Cup under the eyes of the world. The tournament proceeded. The world came to Argentina. The games were played. Argentina won, beating the Netherlands 3-1 in the final in Buenos Aires, after a famously controversial match against Peru, in which Argentina needed to win by 4 goals and won by 6, raising questions that have never been fully answered. The Argentine players celebrated in a stadium filled with ticker tape and joy. A few kilometers from the stadium, in a detention center called ESMA, prisoners were being tortured. Some accounts suggest they could hear the roaring of the crowds. The Dutch captain, Ruud Krol, later said that the Netherlands squad had debated at length whether to boycott the tournament entirely. They decided to play, reasoning that withdrawing would give the junta a propaganda victory. It was an impossible choice, as moral choices in sport so often are. There was no right answer. There was only the match and the stadium and the noise, and outside the stadium, the silence of the disappeared. Football at its most uncomfortable is football being held up to the world it exists within. The 1978 World Cup did not redeem Argentina's government, but the Argentine people who filled those stadiums were not the government. They were people who loved football and who, for those weeks, were allowed to forget. Perhaps they should not have been allowed to forget. Perhaps the forgetting was the point. These are questions that football cannot answer, but that football, at its most honest, insists on asking. The hand of God and the goal of the century. Maradona, 1986. There are football matches that people remember the way they remember certain days in their own lives. Not because they were there, but because the images entered the culture so completely that they became shared memory. The Argentina versus England quarter-final at the 1986 World Cup in Mexico City is one of those matches. The context mattered. 4 years earlier, Argentina and Britain had fought the Falklands War, a brief, bitter conflict over a group of islands in the South Atlantic that left several hundred people dead on both sides and a wound in the relationship between the two countries that had not healed. Now, in the sweltering heat of the Estadio Azteca, they were playing football. Diego Maradona was 25 years old. He was already, by general consensus, the best footballer in the world, a player of extraordinary technical gifts, compact and powerful and low to the ground, almost impossible to knock off the ball, with a left foot that could do things that seemed to require more than the usual number of joints. He had come from the Villa Fiorito shantytown in Buenos Aires. He had played on the Potrero. He had learned the game with his body close to the ground, the ball always close to his feet, in spaces too small for most players to operate. In the 51st minute of the quarter-final, Maradona scored with his hand. A high ball bounced in the penalty area. Maradona jumped for it, and his left hand, clearly, visibly, undeniably, punched it into the net. The English players appealed. The referee, Ali bin Nasser of Tunisia, had not seen it. He gave the goal. Maradona celebrated. He looked at his teammates. He was not certain the goal would stand, and then it stood. Afterwards, he said that the goal had been scored a little with the head of Maradona and a little with the hand of God. The phrase, cynical, brilliant, defiant, funny, became one of the most famous sentences in the history of sport. 4 minutes after the hand of God, Maradona scored what FIFA has voted the goal of the century. He received the ball in his own half, 60 metres from the English goal, and ran. He ran past Peter Reid. He ran past Terry Butcher. He ran past Terry Fenwick. He ran past Terry Butcher again, who had recovered and come back to try to stop him. He rounded the goalkeeper Peter Shilton and rolled the ball into the net. 6 England players, 60 metres, 11 seconds. The entire English defence, one of the best in world football, dismantled by a single human being running with a ball at his feet. The BBC commentator Barry Davies said, as Maradona ran toward goal, "You have to say, that is magnificent." It was the most restrained possible response to what was happening. When Maradona was asked about that goal 20 years later, he said, "When I'm asked which was the best goal I scored, I say the second one against England." He did not mean the hand of God. He meant the one where he ran. Argentina won the match 2-1. They went on to win the 1986 World Cup, beating West Germany 3-2 in the final. Maradona lifted the trophy in Mexico City, his dark curly hair damp with sweat, his eyes bright, surrounded by his teammates. He was 25 years old. He had, in the space of 4 minutes in a quarter-final against England, scored the most controversial goal and the greatest goal in the history of the World Cup. No one has managed both at once since. No one may ever again. Italia 90, the tournament that broke hearts and changed everything. The 1990 World Cup in Italy is one of the most argued about tournaments in the history of the sport. It was, statistically, the least attacking World Cup ever held, an average of 2.21 goals per game, the lowest on record. It produced some of the most negative, defensive, tactically timid football the tournament had ever seen. Teams played to avoid losing rather than to win. The knockout rounds were dominated by tight, nervous matches that frequently went to penalties. And yet, Italia 90 is also one of the most emotionally remembered tournaments in history. The music helped. Nessun Dorma, the Puccini aria, used as the BBC's theme for their coverage, became forever associated with that summer and played whenever football tried to describe itself as something larger than sport. The moments were extraordinary, even when the football was not. Roger Miller of Cameroon, 38 years old, coming off the bench to score and celebrate by dancing around the corner flag. His joy so unself-conscious and complete that it felt like a rebuke to everyone who had ever played the game with calculation rather than love. Salvatore Schillaci of Italy, a small Sicilian striker no one had expected much from, finishing as the tournament's top scorer with a look of disbelieving joy on his face after every goal, as if he could not quite believe he was there. The semi-finals between England and West Germany, and Italy and Argentina, both ending in penalty shootouts, both producing tears that the cameras found with uncomfortable precision and broadcast to the world. England's Paul Gascoigne, 23 years old, the most naturally gifted English player of his generation, a man of enormous talent and considerable vulnerability in roughly equal measure, received a yellow card in the semi-final against West Germany that meant that if England reached the final, he would be suspended and would miss it. The moment he realised this, his face crumpled. He was playing in a World Cup semi-final on a stage he had spent his entire life working toward, and he started to cry. On the pitch, in front of millions of people, in the middle of the match. His captain Gary Lineker saw it and mouthed to the bench, "Have a word with him." Gascoigne's tears, became the image of Italia '90, the image of all the feeling that football produces, the vulnerability of caring about something this much, the absolute exposure of the human heart that the game demands and then displays without mercy. England lost on penalties. Gascoigne never played in a World Cup final. The moment passed and did not come again. Some moments are like that. The window opens and closes, and you are left with what you had, which was almost enough, which is the story of many lives and many footballers, and perhaps most things we love. West Germany won Italia '90, beating Argentina 1-0 in the final through an Andreas Bremer penalty in the 85th minute. It was not a good final. It was a fitting end to a tournament that had been many things: thrilling, exhausting, beautiful, frustrating, heartbreaking, and completely, totally unforgettable. That is what the World Cup does at its best. Not always beautiful, not always just, but always felt. And so we rest at the end of our second journey through the history of football. We have been through a great deal. Through the silence of 200,000 people in the Maracanã, learning that certainty is not the same as outcome. Through Stockholm in 1958, watching a 17-year-old boy score 2 goals in a World Cup final and then weep on the pitch because he could not contain what he was feeling. Through Amsterdam and the elegant revolution of total football, through the impossible demands of Di Stefano, the sound of Anfield, the discomfort of Buenos Aires in 1978, through those 11 seconds in Mexico City when Maradona ran at the English defence and the world held its breath, through Paul Gascoigne's tears on a pitch in Naples and the long, slow final notes of Nessun Dorma. Football is not always beautiful. It is not always fair. It does not always reward the best or punish the worst. It breaks hearts with complete indifference to whether the hearts deserve breaking. But in the moments we have described, in that second goal against England, in Pelé's volley in Stockholm, in Cruyff's half-second of invention on a touchline in 1974, it produces something that has no name in any language, but that everyone who loves the game has felt at least once. The sense that a human being has just done something at the very edge of what human beings can do. That is worth something. That is worth a great deal. Rest well, fellow traveller. We hope this journey brought you somewhere good. In the next episode, we reach the present, the Premier League, Ronaldo and Messi, the women's game finding its full voice, and the quiet, essential question of what football means and why, after everything, we still love it so much.